This is Transqat, a safe space to stand. Transgender issues, queer people, respectful conversations. I'm host Clare McCarthy. Welcome to Transqat. Welcome to episode 100 of Transqat the podcast. This show requires a lot of time, effort, heart, and money, and it's very much a DIY effort to have produced 100 conversations, 100 voices of queer people and their lived experience. It's an accomplishment I'm proud of. Transqat has allowed me to be part of a community, something I probably wouldn't have had the courage to do otherwise. Reaching out is not my strong suit, and Transqat pushes me past my comfort zone. Now, I feel part of a chosen family of lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, and two-spirit folks, as well as our allies. And I'm better for that. The show has brought me into a support network of organizations fighting for our rights. It has been instrumental in allowing me to create friendships that have changed my life. Transqat gives me purpose, gives me community, and on a good day, it gives me hope. Thanks for listening. Among Julia Serano's books are these three: Whipping Girl, a transsexual woman on sexism and the scapegoating of femininity, now in its third edition; Excluded, making feminist and queer movements more inclusive; and most recently, Sexed Up, how society sexualizes us and how we can fight back. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Advocate, The Daily Beast, and Time magazine. Her books are used in college courses across North America. I am delighted and honored to welcome her to Transqat's 100th episode.
How are you feeling? How are you doing?
I feel similarly a lot of the time. It's just hard, even on days where the news isn't about like trans people being blamed for every bad thing that's happening. Even just the news in general on a daily basis, it's like a fire hydrant of bad stuff. And then especially in the last month, as you alluded to and what you wanted to talk about, and this last month has been very trying, and there have been days that I've stayed off social media entirely just because I'm like, I want to go into a corner and I'll just like write for myself, do something. But at the same time, you have to, on some level, be engaged. But also, I think it's fine for people to like pull back when.
Well, that's your career, right? Is the ability to compile not the information, not in a news cycle kind of way, but in let's absorb all of this and then let's analyze it. Let's put in the research and try to make sense of it. And so I look to you as a voice of reason in these awful times.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people who I follow on social media who are journalists or activists who are really on top of every like trans-related news story, and I'm very glad they're doing it because I can't. And a lot of the writing that I've been doing lately is just kind of about how prejudice works in a more general sense, kind of basically extending of stuff that I've talked about in the other books, but kind of like taking it to another level. And that is oftentimes easier for me to focus on because it's definitely related. And I don't think we would have gotten here if the average person understood how prejudice works in a more general way. It's sort of like slightly off topic, so I can get absorbed in it, but it doesn't feel like as immediate of a threat as the news cycle does. I'm Julia Serano. I am primarily a writer. I write about gender, sexuality, science, and social justice. I'm the author of 5 books. The one that most people are familiar with is my first book, Whipping Girl, a transsexual woman on sexism and the scapegoating of femininity. I might have gotten that slightly wrong, but something like that. It has all those words in it.
Hold on. A transsexual woman on sexism and the scapegoating of femininity is correct.
Yeah, I got it.
Also, we will be talking today about some of the ideas you put out in. Am I right in saying this is the most recent?
Yes, it's the most recent. Sexed Up came out in 2022.
To that end, I did want to analyze the way we as trans people have been depicted really since the 2024 election, because I think I see a lot of your theories being enacted in the playbook that's being used. And they do keep pivoting in terms of what it is they're focusing on and what it is they're arguing against. But to that end, maybe we could just start with having you summarize a couple of the models that you put forth in Sexed Up. Marked and unmarked, we talked a little bit about in an episode last year when I had the filmmaker Logan Ward on talking about the documentary you were in. So give us the elevator pitch on marked, unmarked.
Sure. And I can give a little bit of background to where my thinking has gone with this. So when I was working on Whipping Girl, while I wouldn't have called it an identity politics book, that's a complicated issue, but it's very much from the standpoint of a trans woman saying, looking at the world and talking about, these are the types of marginalization that I face, that trans people more generally face, and specifically trans misogyny came out of that, about types of prejudice that target people on the trans female or trans feminine spectrum. And so I was very much kind of sort of focused on that. But a thing that intrigued me was how a lot of the more general sentiments, so a huge sentiment that affects trans people and especially trans women, is the idea that we're fake or artificial in some way or another. And that comes up in almost every form of marginalization that happens. You can see those type of sentiments towards, people of color, people with disabilities, the greater LGBTQ plus spectrum, and so on. And so a number of these things came up over and over and over again. And I wanted to understand, what are the parallels? They're all different forms of marginalization. I'm not trying to flatten them or say they're the same, but there are these parallels that come up over and over again. And kind of my research on that led me to, in my second book, Excluded, was where I first introduced the unmarked, marked mindset. And then I expand on it in Sexed Up, where it becomes a even greater part of the book. And I did not come up with this idea. This is an idea that originated in linguistics and in the field of semiotics, which is studying signs. And that a lot of times when we create categories, particularly categories where there are two groups, one group is the unmarked group, who usually aren't named explicitly and who are just seen as normal and natural and the default. They're seen as universal. And the counter group, the other group, is marked, which means that they're seen as remarkable, and they're often seen as questionable, both in the sense that people might ask a lot of questions about them, or they might question their existence, right? And so you can immediately see, as a trans person, how when you come out, you get bombarded with questions about, oh, did you play with dolls when you were a kid? Have you had the surgery? All these types of... And as a trans person, I had a hard time really understanding why these people were doing it. But I realize in retrospect, it's because we're marked. And so people feel like it's natural to ask us questions, but that can also be really invasive and it can also be delegitimizing. No one would ever ask a cisgender person, oh, how did you know you were, cisgender, or when did you first know, right? So
it betrays a perspective of this clump of people at the center of things who are assuming they are the default, looking out at the margins and feeling entitled to ask any sort of question because they've marked us as different, therefore possibly suspect, possibly to be regulated, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. And the reverse is not true. If you can't question a person about their being cisgender, or you can't say, well, not all children turn out to be cisgender, so maybe we should like intervene or question their genders. Like people would just immediately freak out, and that's
Yeah.
because like being in the unmarked group, it's you're unquestionable and immutable. Like the idea is like, you're the idea of changing you, like it's not even a possibility, where the marked group is mutable and people are always trying to figure out how can the marked group align themselves more with the immutable unmarked group.
That's
um
certainly, I don't know if you experienced this when you came out and started transitioning, but I had a real sense of, in a lot of the social groups I used to belong to, there was a degree of, okay, because we're sort of lefty progressive types, I will tolerate this as long as you still conform in terms of X, Y, and Z.
mhm.
As long as this is the only peccadillo, the only peculiarity you have, I'll deal with it. But if you cross that line, no support.
Yeah. Yeah, that can definitely exist, and we see it a lot now. And I guess we'll get more to like the 2024 politics right now, but you can see it, or we'll get to that in a minute. But
Yeah.
just to bring up one example from that is the way in which there's, particularly in the Democratic Party, there's a lot of talk about, well, like, well, trans people, we're asking for asking too much, and so it's just like a given that trans people should move themselves more towards kind of like cis normativity and kind of like like step back from like speaking about our perspectives, and that's the exact same dynamic that you just mentioned. Yeah.
One of the things that I think it was in Whipping Girl that really struck me was the notion of depictions of us tend to, and this comes from that unmarked perspective, depictions of us tend to focus on the moment of transformation with the idea that this is something artificial. And the phrase that I came up with to deal with it is the superhero montage, right?
Hmm.
In any superhero movie, there's a part where Batman goes into the cave, or Bruce Wayne goes into the cave, and you get this montage of putting on the belt buckle and putting on the cowl and donning the gloves, and then ta-da, it's somebody different. And that depictions of us, when they are not created by us, tend to focus on that artificialness of it.
Yeah, and you can see it a lot with, I like the analogy of the superhero and the Batman thing, because we're watching the Batman movie, but we know that he's really Bruce Wayne underneath.
Right.
And so like there's not this idea that he's actually really Batman and really expressing himself, but when he's Bruce Wayne, that's fake, right? It's the opposite. And he and Clark Kent and all of the other, they're always worried that they'll be like figured out for who they
Right.
really are. And that is just such a trans metaphor of, I move through the world and like people generally don't pay much attention to me. They just see me as a woman, and I'm just doing normal things. But as soon as something comes up that may reveal that I'm trans, all of a sudden like the dynamics completely change. And I thankfully I live in Oakland, California. I'm in the Bay Area. I live in a city. And it's not safe for any trans people right now
Yeah.
in this country, but relative to a lot of people, I'm in a relatively safe place where if I come out to transgender, the vast majority of people kind of in my local community would be like, "Oh, okay." Like, and they probably already know trans people and they probably won't super freak out about it. And that's not true everywhere. But yeah, that whole dynamic of like, people see us as, the like really a man, like that's the true like essence of me, and everything else is this false pretense. And that's
Right.
totally in the depictions of trans people, where in reality it's like very much the opposite. Like the imagined really a man thing is like, that's like a shell of a person that I very much felt like I was performing. Um,
Right.
from like for me now, like almost 25 years ago, like that's like a total distant thing, but for them, that's like the real underneath truth.
Whereas the accurate view is that I was performing the gender I was expected to perform for 55 years. And that was the artificiality. That was me blocking off the authentic and saying, okay, I can't get accepted, so I will try my best to do what you all want. And that was the artificial. This is the authentic. $21 million in the 2024 presidential campaign spent specifically on targeting trans people ads. And a lot of that was trans athletes, but it was also stoking this fear of trans women or trans femme people in designated spaces for women. And I thought maybe that might be a good place to start in terms of how were we portrayed and what models does that fit into?
Sure, yeah. So I would say there's this gradual process where if a lot of us may recall that like around like 2015, 2016, a lot of Republicans in state legislatures were trying to pass like bathroom bills, where, like restroom related bills that would not allow trans people to use the correct public restroom. And most of it didn't really get far. And in the case of like North Carolina, where it was passed to a certain degree, that there was this big backlash. And I think like the basketball all-star game, they moved the basketball all-star game, and Bruce Springsteen canceled his shows. Like, and so
thank you, Bruce.
Yeah. And anyway, pointing that out, that was just seen as like a beyond the pale sort of thing. It's like, trans people are fine, just let them use the restroom, is sort of the attitude people had.
Yeah.
But they built it very slowly. And I've followed this over the years. Unfortunately, I had front row seats. As the anti-trans movement started, a lot of it was online. A lot of it was sort of like anti-trans parent groups who began working together with both the religious conservatives that most people are familiar with, like social conservatives, and then the so-called gender critical or TERFs, who don't really have that big of a voice here in the US, but have a humongous voice, and are very mainstreamed in the United Kingdom. And they work together very slowly, some being more extreme than others, but to basically make trans people questionable, like one way or another. And the two things that they focused on in early one was gender affirming care for trans youth. That is, even though there's a lot of, and I have an essay online that lists like well over 100 references showing that the gender affirming approach for trans youth works, and it's very highly efficacious, as they say. Like there's very little, a very small percentage of people who later like regret that, right? Very small. And anyway, but it doesn't matter because it's very easy to put that kernel of doubt into cisgender people's minds, especially if they're thinking that trans people are really this but pretending to be that. It's really easy for them to be like, oh, actually this is concerning, we should maybe not be doing this to children, right? It doesn't occur to them that the children may actually authentically be trans. So that was the one that they worked on a lot in the late 2010s. And then the issue of sports came up more and more. And that's another one that also is really easy to like get into kind of the average person, where they might be like, oh, well, I'm fine with trans people. But actually, now that you pointed out, I do have concerns about men competing against young girls. And it's always men competing against young girls, right? It's even though, like, especially in school levels, you're usually competing against people of the same age group. And I think both of those were perfect wedge issues and using the word wedge issue as it's something that can break up a coalition. It can kind of split people up. And so basically, instead of the overwhelming majority who in the mid 2010s thought it was a bridge too far to do bathroom bills against trans people, some of those people were like convinced, oh, maybe I should be suspicious of, the sports issue or gender affirming care for youth issues.
Hi, folks. It's Clare interrupting. I'll keep this brief. Please consider donating to support the show. If you go to transqat.com, that's transqat.com, hit the support button and then donate. You can also visit the Transqat store and support us that way. And if you're a business or an organization, please consider sponsoring the show. Thank you for your support.
And then that eventually opened the door to everything else. And this is something I say when people raise concerns about trans people in sports. I bring up that it's a wedge issue. And I say it's a wedge issue that has worked because in the United States, every single state that has passed a trans sports bill has also passed bills banning or restricting gender affirming care, sometimes not just for youth, but sometimes affecting adults. Mm-hmm. And then once they do that, then it's like really easy to roll out the restrooms, to roll out the and then now we're in even the more extreme levels where like they're trying to paint all trans people as terrorists, and that has other issues involved, but I think that's what happened. They just sort of pushed I hate using the term Overton window because I think it gets used a lot, but is essentially what happened. Like we've just gotten pushed back where now there are more extreme attitudes against trans people making headway legislatively and in the government than in like back when I was first transitioning.
Well, one of the points you make is that unfair accusations like that these aren't trans women athletes. These are biological men trying to gain an unfair advantage, that trans youth are somehow either being duped into wanting to transition or in some of the stories that got told, forced, right? There was that Wisconsin rally that Trump gave where he told the story of little Jimmy going off to school and coming home after a sex change operation. You point out that accusations like that stick to marked people much more easily than to unmarked people. That if for example, I have done speaking engagements where the Facebook town group will light up with comments about me being a pedophile, people are much more willing to join on and jump on that than if, you disagree with the way the high school baseball coach is starting the lineup or whatever.
Yeah. Even though the vast majority of pedophiles are cisgender men, right?
Right.
And so, there's definitely a lot going on here. So there's definitely the markedness, the trans people being marked. And I describe it sometimes as when you're marked, it's like you're sticky. You're seen as you have something, and that something is sticky, so that all sorts of meanings and value judgments and stereotypes and ulterior motives and all these things can be thrown at you, and they just stick to you, right? Yeah. Another example I use of that is the way in which the perpetual, endless litany of causes of why people are trans. And this has been on my mind because last month, like Elon Musk said that he thinks that the reason why there's so many trans people is because that the left has made a lot of basically like white cisgender men feel uncomfortable about just being men. And so that's why there are all these trans people now. And so it's obviously a joke, like a lot of the imagined causes. It totally ignores people on the trans male and trans masculine spectrum. It's like, well, then how do you explain all these people wanting to become men, right? But there's this endless list of causes. I have a piece where I go through all of them. I have a passage in Sexed Up where I name a whole bunch of them, and they don't make any sense together, right? It's like it's dominant mothers, or it's environmental pollution, or it's, peer pressure or social contagion, or it's this or it's that. And it doesn't make any sense. They all are just anything people can think of out of their head, and they can just put it on Twitter, and like some people take that seriously. But the thing is that these causes are all sticking to us because we are marked, right? So just like stereotypes will stick to us, and assumptions about us stick to us, and causes stick to us. So yeah, that's definitely something that's happening that's related to markedness. I think once we get into, since you brought up the pedophile, the groomer charge, I can also talk about this because this is a related but slightly different type of mindset that I talk about in Sexed Up, which I kind of call the stigma contamination mindset. Stigma attaches to marked people. And we mostly think of stigma in terms of like shame, like, oh, I feel stigma about being trans. But you can, as an individual, overcome that stigma and feel like good about yourself and proud about yourself. But in the minds of other people, the way people view stigma is they imagine it to like function like a contagion, which is not just that it's contagious, but a contagion is a specific type of magical thinking where you assume that any contact with a stigmatized object or person like permanently spoils you or ruins you. And in some cases, you're imagined to be turned into that yourself, right?
Okay, I would just like to apologize because my last name is McCarthy, and a famous McCarthy did that with communism.
Yeah.
Right. That, if I can stick the label of communist on you, then all of these other assumptions must be true as well. You must be a threat to national security. So apologies for the McCarthyism, but
so the stigma is it not only means that you're marked as a trans person, but when you're stigmatized, and there can be different levels of stigmatization, but groups who are really highly stigmatized in like the eyes of others, like people don't want to go near you, they want nothing to do with you, they don't want to touch you, they don't want to interact with you, and essentially they start viewing themselves as pure and untainted, and you are this contaminated, corrupting force that your presence ends up like infecting the rest of the people, whether it's you as an individual or your family or as a society. And as soon as you start bringing up the idea of purity, like immediately you start thinking of like far right thinking, the idea that we're the pure group of people, and people, of whatever pure group it is, whether it's like white or cisgender, that your contacts with like the corresponding minorities will like lead to degeneration is something that they are often obsessed about. That's not a real biological thing, but kind of like you de-evolve and you become one of them, right? You can see from that how it can go from like just having concerns about sports, that some people who take it to these extremes where they really have this very stigmatized view of trans people, they imagine us as this contaminating, infecting force that's like ruining society and potentially turning their children trans and so forth. And that's where the so-called groomer allegations come from. And I talk about this a lot in Sexed Up, which kind of not funny. I finished writing that at the end of 2021. And so before it came out in the spring of 2022, that was the period of time where all the Republicans just kept saying the word groomer, grooming over and over and over again. So unfortunately, my book spoke to that before it became such a mainstream thing. But I also think this tendency to paint trans people as dangerous when there's like zero evidence that we're dangerous, neither in restrooms, neither when it comes to shootings or terrorism, right? There's no evidence that we are like disproportionately likely to do that. Again, all of these things, whether it's, sexual assaults, whether it's shootings, like these are predominantly done by cisgender men. Like there's lots of statistics, and a lot of them are even more, if anybody disproportionately does it, it tends to be people who with more far right leanings, right? But it just all these ideas stick to us, and this whole attempt right now to basically make trans people the cause of everything bad that's happening in the eyes of the current administration and other people in kind of like the far right circles. That's just what's driving it, and it becomes really frustrating in trying to talk about this with other people, like say like normie people, who are not as familiar with the far right and their ideas of thinking about us. And you get, again, like these mainstream or centrist Democrats saying, well, maybe we should pull back on the trans sports and maybe we should do this. And I just want to shout at them, like, the trans sports thing, that's like 4 years ago now, right?
Yeah,
Like that's when that started. That battle, it's kind of essentially over, not meaning that trans people won't ever play sports again, but that a lot of legislative bodies, including a lot of the bodies that run all the track and field and all the swimming against, like they've all changed their policies. So that's not even an issue now. The issue is that basically the far right has literally conspiratorial views of trans people as being the cause of everything bad. And some of those people might be doing it in a very consciously politically manipulative way that, like, oh, we'll just make trans people the scapegoat for this issue. But a lot of these people, they literally believe that they are pure and that trans people are a corrupting force that they have to eradicate. And they use that very language over and over and over again. I just want to shout at if there are any centrist Democrats right now, politicians, I just want to shout at you and say they are really unhinged, and they're just going to keep pushing this until someone stands up and say, your views of trans people are unhinged, right? Yeah. Or in the words of Tim Walz over the last election campaign, and I hate that they made him stop saying it, is, you people are weird. You have very weird views. Most normal people don't think about children's genitals. Most normal people don't fear trans people shooting them or attacking them in restrooms. You are literally unhinged. And until the mainstream society realizes that that's what the conversation is right now, hopefully people learn about this, because the average person, you look at all the polls and there's about a third of the people who like detest trans people and like want to take away all our rights, and about a third of the people are pro-trans and like will say so, sometimes even loudly in public. And the big middle of the country doesn't really care. They're just like, I don't care about trans people. Why are you talking about them so much? And it's really easy to just take that like 2/3 majority of the country and to speak to them and say, do you know what I want as someone running for the Congress or someone running for the Senate? I want to get weirdos who have unhinged thoughts, who constantly obsess about trans people. I want to replace them with people who actually care about normal stuff and who aren't going to demonize people who are their enemies, whether they're, again, trans people, LGBTQ people more generally. So much of the MAGA movement is like very outwardly racist, and hostile to people of color, especially with all the ICE raids and all that stuff that's been going on. Anyway,
misogyny is misogyny,
yes.
That transphobia and homophobia is just misogyny with a new coat of paint on it. It is these underlying beliefs that women have a very specific role, and that role involves both the Madonna and the whore, right? You are to run the household, you are in charge of raising the kids, but there are also expectations as to how attractive you need to be an effective woman. These fears, these anxieties that they stoke about us really kind of come down to that. These expectations that the patriarchy has for women applied to this new group over here.
Yeah, definitely. And I talk about that a lot in Whipping Girl. I talk about oppositional versus oppositional versus traditional sexism, and how they kind of come together to both create like a lot of the double binds women face, but also that they play out in trans people's lives in different ways. And in Sex Up, I talk a lot about this, but again, in Sex Up, I frame a lot of this around the idea of stigma and contamination, and specifically that there's one chapter where I kind of summarize a lot of our society's attitudes towards women, and especially women with regards to sex and sexuality, as women are sex and sex is bad, right? Women are stigmatized in a lot of ways. And this is a way of thinking about it. There's a lot of feminist work on like the ways in which women are sexualized, whether it's like related to objectification or things like rape culture. And I talk about all that in the book. And, you know, that's like definitely one model that is true in a lot of cases. But another way of looking at it is women are viewed as sex. Men are not sex, right? Like when we talk about sex, men take sex or have sex or right? Like they are not sex.
And they are entitled to that.
They're
thought that they're socialized, they're conditioned to believe that if you're a good guy, you're entitled to that.
Sure. But they can't be sex, right? Women are sex. And so the way that plays out is we talked about like if you're trans, you and that's stigmatized, you might feel the need to, they call it stigma management, the people who study stigma. So you might manage it, right? And so like if you're a trans person, you might work really hard to make sure that you pass, to make sure that people don't find out about, you know, your past and so forth like that. That's stigma management. And you can view a lot of the like the virgin whore double bind, a lot of it is women are sex, but if you hide your sex, if you play down your sex to a certain degree, if you're a respectable woman, then you can be seen as like legitimate and someone like say worth marrying, but that also involves you kind of partaking in a patriarchal thing where, you know, you're supplying, you know, sex and reproduction to the patriarch of the family. Okay. The other thing I want to say, but just to finish that idea up, so there's kind of like a stigma management going on there. And the idea that trans people raise, for one thing, there's the blurring of the borders between men and women, which becomes, if you really believe that women are sex and you're a man and you're not sex, but you take sex, the idea of trans people and LGBTQ people more generally, like really like messes with your worldview. The idea of, you know, you can see this on a lot of like the manosphere and a lot of like bro culture. There's this idea of like, does that make me gay? Or there's this idea that men can become contaminated and become sex. And there's stigma associated with that. So I think a lot of the ways in which trans people are stigmatized and women are stigmatized, and the fear that people who are deemed untainted by sex can become corrupted and become sex. All these ideas are very intertwined, and you can see it once you like start noticing these connections. It pops up over and over again in like the rhetoric.
Transqat is on the air. The program will be broadcast on WESU 88.1 FM, Middletown, Connecticut, beginning Tuesday, September 9th. Transqat has acquired the coveted 1 to 2 a.m. slot. It's an honor to be part of WESU's programming. The station's first official broadcast was on November 9th, 1939. That means they're only a few years away from their 90th anniversary. So, if you find yourself awake and within 90 miles or so of Wesleyan's Exley Science Center, tune in to WESU 88.1 FM.
This culture of brodom is put in a position where they need to be hyper vigilant about their masculinity. You can't give any sort of indication that what are you, gay? And I spent a lot of my life hyper vigilant about that. I used to worry. I grew up in the 80s, so mall culture was a part of my adolescence, and would be walking around through the mall, and I would actually worry that somebody would notice me looking in at the prom gown store. and your gestures and, you know, references to something, I had to be so hyper vigilant all the time. And it is weird to me that I then have things in common with these people in the manosphere, which I detest.
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely, everyone has a slightly different path. I joke that, half joking, but there's some truth to it. Like when I was in elementary school, um, I sort of had the biggest girls are yucky sort of, I don't want to call it a phase. It was more like a defense mechanism. And I think it was because I was really, really kind of as a trans person trying to like put as much distance between me and girls, partially because I knew there wasn't that there,
Yeah.
and partially to convince everyone around me that that was the case. And then like growing up, just I think everyone's like life course is a little bit different, and so I kind of got through like later as a young adult. It was still moving through the world as Mal. I like had long hair, and I did stuff that had people like read me as like as eccentric, but I still
Mm.
had to be very hyper vigilant if I didn't want people to read me as queer, which at a certain point I stopped caring about. And the couple years before my transition, that was very helpful to just be like, I'm just going to be myself now, and however people read me, they read me.
It's compelling to me that all of these fears, all of these things that are sticking to us, are largely only sticking to trans femme folks. The bathroom bills were not at all concerned with female to male transgender folks. Neither is sports. I mean, every level of sporting agreed that, yeah, that's fine. If you were born female and you want to compete in male, great, fine, not a problem. When Nancy Mace puts forward this bill that Sarah McBride's not allowed in the bathroom, it would not have been an issue if Sarah were a trans man. All of these laws that are worded as prohibiting trans people from stepping over some imaginary line are really A, only directed at trans women, and B, only directed at trans women who don't have passing privilege.
Yeah. I will add to that. So I agree generally. I will add to that that for a lot of like trans men that in jurisdictions where there are all these bathroom bills, that they are screwed over by them just as much because they might not be safe in the men's room, but if they go to women's room, and there are instances of trans men or trans masculine people going to the women's room in a state where they legally are supposed to because of the bathroom bill, and them getting assaulted and attacked and everything like that. So these things definitely affect all of us, to varying degrees. I do believe I describe trans misogyny and whipping girl in a particular way at the intersection of oppositional and traditional sexism, which people can read about that. I have a online article from a few years back called "What is Trans Misogyny?" that like I go into all this. So if you're interested in that, you can find that. Also, my website, juliaserano.com. If you go to the writings page, I literally have links to like everything I've written online for like 20 years now. So anyway, there's that way of looking at it. But since we're talking about like unmarked versus marked, another way of conceptualizing trans misogyny is that we live in a society where being trans is marked, but being cis is not. But also being female or feminine is marked, or being male or masculine are not marked. And I think a lot of intersectionality is a very complex. I think it can happen through different mechanisms, but I think one mechanism that it happens is people who fall in the marked group in two different ways end up being like essentially viewed as doubly marked. So you're viewed as like twice as questionable and twice as conspicuous and twice as artificial and so forth. So I think because of that, there's this tendency to have the focus be on trans female, trans feminine people, in a way that like sometimes people will call that visibility, but it's usually for trans people not a good visibility. It's usually hyper scrutinization. It's like I would kill for trans people to be largely invisible right now, but like we're not. We're highly visible because we're being targeted
Right.
by all these different political forces. So yeah, so I definitely think that that is a lot of the reason why, or that's one explanation for why trans female and trans feminine people tend to be the main focus of a lot of the anti-trans movement that's happening.
And we come to the last couple of weeks. So this shooter in Minneapolis, clearly a deeply disturbed person, plans this shooting on Annunciation Catholic school. Yeah, and they happen to be in church at the time. Has a rifle, a shotgun, a handgun, has it all planned out, blocks exits, and then just opens fire through the window. And somehow, in almost every news story, particularly the ones on the right, in that opening paragraph, they felt the need to point out that a few years back, this person had petitioned for a name change. And therefore, this long simmering conspiracy theory is brought to the fore that there is a wave of trans inflicted violence and we need to do something about it.
Yeah. So, and people have done statistics, and particularly between that and then the more recent event, the Charlie Kirk shooting, where people on the right assumed it was a trans shooter before there's any news. And then it turned out shooter's not trans. But then there's stories of, and I still haven't heard the full story, but it sounds like their roommate they were in a relationship with their roommate, and their roommate was sometimes described as gay, but some people describe as they might have been transitioning or something like that. So they might have been a trans feminine spectrum person. So then that became the thing, and then they started twisting that into that this guy who the shooter was this Mormon who came from a Republican family, but then he was corrupted by this this trans person in their life, right? So you can see all the stuff I was talking about, stigma, a pure person who's corrupted by the evil group. In the wake of both these shootings, there have been numerous articles that have pointed out the actual statistics, that there's just like no statistics. There are occasionally trans shooters because we are a demographic, and all demographics potentially are involved in these. Some of them are cisgender women. The overwhelming majority are cisgender men.
97% of mass shooters, is the statistic I've seen, are cisgender, heterosexual white guys.
Yeah.
Period.
Exactly, yeah. I think that it's a mixture of some people on the far right viewing us as, again, this corrupting force that they want to exterminate or eradicate. And so they both jump to the conclusions that it must be us, but they also want it to be us because then that justifies kind of what they want to do to us. So there's that going on. There's also this thing where, particularly for a lot of these shooters, if there's absolutely zero hints of them being trans, a lot of these shooters tend to have far right leanings, or they spend a lot of times on like, neo-Nazi or far right, like web cultures, online cultures. And in those cases, they always just get described as a lone wolf or someone who had mental issues, or whatever, because they can't blame themselves because they are pure. Their beliefs are pure. And so it can never be them. And that's why when, definitely the Minnesota shooting of I forget her name, from the state legislator. So an actual state politician who was horribly murdered by someone who had very clear like right-wing leanings, like that just doesn't get talked about. So there's a lot of, again, that group is like unmarked, so they can never be it. If it is them, it isn't discussed. You never shoot someone because you're white or because you're cisgender or because you're heterosexual or because you're male. It always has to be some other reason, right? And like again, like the idea that a lot of in those cases that they're mentally ill, that's like essentially blaming, people with disabilities, people who have, all sorts of various types of like, conditions that they have, like mental health related conditions. The overwhelming majority of whom don't get involved in any kind of like violence, right? Who aren't shooters, right?
Well, mental illness is another marginalized community, right?
Exactly,
So
yeah.
it's easier to impart motives and actions to those people on the margins.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so I think that just that combination and like the way that trans people are stigmatized, and since I was talking earlier about like if what I would yell to like a centrist Democrat politician if they would ever like listen to me is you might not care about the way that they're hyper stigmatizing trans people, but they're increasingly doing that to the Democratic Party more generally, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it's definitely they're really gunning for trans people, and then they will just use Antifa all the time, even though like Antifa isn't an actual organization. It's
Yeah.
just kind of a mindset of being anti-fascism,
Fascist.
right?
Yeah.
But the more and more, like, so Stephen Miller, who's the, I think, deputy chief of staff, very high up in the Trump administration, who appears to be responsible for like a lot of the really bad stuff that's happening. He's already describing like the Democrats as this basically with the same type stigmatizing, dehumanizing language of it's this like I don't have a quote in front of me, but to paraphrase, as this like corruption, this evil corruption that's going to bring down the country and needs to be brought under control, right? So understanding how this stigma works and listening to stigmatized people about like what their experiences are could potentially prepare us for what may be more increasing attacks on people more generally on the political left or people who have any kind of Democrat affiliation.
It's also this just genius distraction ploy in that you've got these two horrific shootings and nobody is talking about, well, maybe access to guns is what causes mass shootings. And nobody's talking about the fact that, well, maybe access to effective mental health care would decrease the number of mass shootings, and maybe doing something about the extremist online cultures that are clearly influencing some of these shooters. And all of those sort of logical conversations, we jump right over them and we go right to, yep, there's trans violence and we need to do something about those trans people. It to me, it's disingenuous because it shows you don't really want to fix the problem.
Mm-hmm.
The problem has to do with guns. Fix it.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree that the talking about like what groups of people disproportionately are causing these mass shooting events and everything, and we were talking about how they, skew very heavily male, they skew more people on the political and especially far right. And the statistic that's like even more broader than that is something like 95% of all like kind of mass terrorist acts happen in the US.
Yeah.
And that's because of guns, because we are the only country that kind of allows that level of gun ownership. And again, not talking at this point, even though like I think the Charlie Kirk shooting happened with like the kind of rifle you would use to go hunting. Almost all these other events are happening where people like just have all of these, like
high powered.
Yeah, high powered. Sometimes I'll say assault rifle, and people will be like, "Oh, well, that's not an assault rifle." Or and so I don't know what the specific definitions are, but the ones where you can just shoot a whole spray of bullets at somebody without having to reload. I 100% agree that it's definitely about the guns. I think most people in the country, and polling shows that most people in the country are pro gun control, particularly for the kind of the more extreme types of guns and ammunitions that essentially enable these sort of mass killings.
So here's the part where we solve the problems.
Okay, let's get to it.
How do we counter these messages? If we are perceived as being marked and therefore suspect, if society is buying into this opposites model that you posit as well, where gender is hard and fast, and these are not to be messed with roles, how do we get the message out that maybe we need to be moving in a different direction? That you and I are not threats to anybody.
I've spent a lot of the last few years writing like really thoughtful essays about all the issues: gender affirming care for trans youth, and restrooms, and sports, and the way in which detransition is. I'm not putting detransition in quotes because I don't believe it exists. There are people who detransition, but the way that it's depicted in the media, often in a very in a way that is a very unrealistic way of looking at the issue and raising fears about it and so forth. And you can find all these on my writings website if you're interested. A lot of the reason why I wrote them is not necessarily to convince the hardcore anti-trans bigots. Hopefully some of them will change their mind over time, but everything that I've seen related to that is very similar to like what you do if someone is a conspiracy theorist. Is the answer is usually it's going to be hard to get through to them unless you're someone who already is very close to them, like family members or old friends. And even then, and that you can look this up. I've read multiple articles about it, that it takes time, but you have to sort of slowly convince them over time of how they've gone down a rabbit hole without just telling them they've gone down a rabbit hole. So anyway, for those people, that's one thing. But the reason why I wrote all these kind of well-researched and thoughtful type of essays is to convince the average everyday person who doesn't know that much about trans people that maybe someone can share them the article and they'll read it and they'll be like, oh, okay, this is much to do about nothing. And I think that type of work can definitely have an impact on people. I've had numerous people write me saying, thank you for that piece. I had all these misconceptions and your piece really helped. What would really help is if somebody who's not, I'm an author, I have a certain platform, I put my essays out in public, I write books. So I have a certain amount of platform, but it'd be nice if like really big people with really big platforms or major media companies would actually write debunking the trans bathroom myth, right? Which is
right.
Sort of the title of one of my pieces. Like you can really easily debunk it, and people have done that. But in the mainstream, a lot of the mainstream press, especially the New York Times and the Atlantics and those type of things, they've increasingly had people write more about raising panic against trans people than kind of doing good reporting on why we're not a threat and actually we're more threatened than a threat to other people. I think all of that can definitely work in a kind of slowly but surely way, but you sort of need the cisgender majority, the people who are 99% of the culture. You need them to decide to do that too.
To step up.
Yeah, to step up. A reason why a lot of my writing right now, that hopefully will be part of what will become my next book, is writing about these mindsets, which I have in Sexed Up, for instance, the unmarked marked mindset and the stigma contagion mindset, writing about them in a way that I think the average person can better understand it and therefore see the telltale signs of when it's happening. I know that a lot of people with the marked unmarked, upon sharing that with them, I've had them go, "Oh my God, I see it all the time." I'll be like looking at somebody for some reason, some way they're different, and I'll start asking myself all these questions about them, and and so on and so forth, or I'll believe they're faking it, or they're not real, and then all of a sudden they catch themselves. And a lot of this is like self-work too, right? I think we all have marked people and stigmatized people in our lives. And I think we all have some unlearning to do. And while it's very useful to like teach people about, this is transphobia and this is homophobia and this is racism and this is misogyny, and you can teach people about those one by one. I talk about this in Excluded and Sexed Up, is that's like a top-down way of looking at it. Like there's kind of a type of prejudice and ism that, and so you address that in the particular group that's targeted by that. That's all important work. I think of these mindsets as sort of like bottom up, because it's like highlighting the parallels between a lot of forms of prejudice. And so it's complementary to the top down, but it creates a way that I would love for the average person to like think about, well, how does stigmatizing people work, and then like, even if you don't care about trans people, you can hear the things coming out of the mouths of, whether it's the current president or right-wing social influencers, or Fox News, like you can hear the language they're using, a lot of which is centered on trans people being contagious or a corrupting force. And that can be, that can help you to realize what they're doing. And if we have language to talk about that, maybe more people, even if people can't articulate what transphobia is, they might be able to look at what's happening and say, wow, trans people are really being stigmatized right now. We should do something about that.
A parallel that I thought of is that at a certain point in my life, I realized I was othering people with heavy people. And I found myself, because I was raised in a very judgmental environment.
As many of us growing up are.
That's kind of what Americans are good at. But I found that I would be attributing character attributes to them because of their weight. The idea that you are lacking in self-control, you are weak in some way, and it wasn't until I started deconstructing myself and realizing, okay, how do you approach this differentness in you, that I started to realize, oh, I do that all the time. I make value judgments about some things that have nothing to do with ethical or moral values. I just attribute them because somewhere along the lines, society taught me that, the 70s and the 80s, take any kid movie from the 70s and 80s. The fat kid is always the one who's the butt of the joke, the one who's the weakest, the silliest, the goofiest. And so I found that was just inculcated in me, and I have had to work to put that aside.
I've heard lots of fat activists. I'm saying fat activists because a lot of people who are activists in this, they like call themselves, in like a kind of self-referential, self-affirming way, reclaiming the word sort of way, fat activists. Anyway, a lot of them will talk about their experiences in the healthcare system, where any kind of health thing that they have, they will often go and the doctors will be like, well, I can't do anything about that because you need to lose weight. And it's all about, everything is about like their weight is like, because that's what's marked. And so that's like, that has to be the cause. And it's like, you just need to exercise more and eat better. And they're like, yeah, but I'm having this medical issue that needs to be taken care of. And it really jumps out at you, especially once you see these parallels and you understand what it means to be marked, like what trans people often call the trans broken arm syndrome, which is like, if you go into the doctor with a broken arm, they're like, well, I don't know anything about transgender people, so I can't really fix it. And it's like, I have a broken arm. My arm is just like everybody else's arm. It has bones and my bone is broken. But it's like the same thing. It's like, well, everything, if you're trans, everything is about you being trans. I've had people like dismiss all sorts of like opinions about like pop culture or other things that don't have anything to do with being trans, and people dismiss it and like, well, that's because you're transgender. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? But it's like, that's what the markedness is. It's always about that, and we blame people for the ways in which they're marked often.
All right, well, now I'm thoroughly depressed. This has been a wonderful conversation. Julia, thank you so much for this. I wanted something special for our 100th, and I'm grateful to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and I've enjoyed our conversation. So, yeah, thanks.
This is Sadie McCarthy. I'm Claire's niece.
And you've just been listening to Transqat. It is made by one of my favorite people in the world, Clare McCarthy.
Transqat is a production of Transqat Enterprises, LLC.
Copyright 2023, all rights reserved.
Join us on the web at transqat.com.
That's TRANSQAT.com.
QAT.com.
QAT.com.
There you'll find links to Transqat, the blog,
writing projects,
speaking engagements,
and our PayPal donations page.
Please consider supporting our mission with your monkeys.
Monies.
Your monies.
Your monies.
Not monkeys.
Please consider supporting our mission with your monies. Any monkeys will be gratefully received as well.
Follow Transqat on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube.
On TikTok, we are at The Real Transqat.
Want to tell your story on air?
Or ask Claire a question?
What is the deal?
She has all the answers.
Or suggest a guest or topic for an upcoming episode.
Use the contact page at the website
or email her directly at crmtranscat@gmail.com.
crmtranscat@gmail.com.
And thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. Bye.